Warm welcome to our latest Farmers Weekly webinar in association with Agrina, Carbon Stacking, What You Need to Know. I'm your host, Johan Tasker. There's lots of reasons for farmers to be interested in carbon markets at the moment, especially given changing agricultural policy and the push towards net zero. As well as other potential benefits, this webinar will map out and discuss the various financial incentives available to farmers for adopting sustainable practices. Among the topics we're going to discuss are how to generate a return from sustainable farming practices, how to receive multiple financial benefits, including from carbon credits and DEFRA's Sustainable Farming Incentive Scheme, and the potential for generating an income from things like biodiversity. And to help us do all of that and more, let me introduce our panel of experts. Cambridgeshire farmer Thomas Gent is UK market lead for Agrina, which runs Europe's largest soil carbon payment programme. Jeremy Moody is secretary and advisor to the Central Association of Agricultural Valuers, a specialist body representing 3,000 professional members. And Staffordshire zero-till farmer Clive Bailey is managing partner of TWB Farms, founder and owner of AgriWeb Media, which operates the Farming Forum. We were also going to be joined by David Evans from farmer-owned grain storage cooperative Trinity Grain, but unfortunately, David can't be with us. But without further ado, I'm going to start with you, Thomas. What exactly do we mean by carbon stacking?
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Johan. I think it's a topic that comes up a lot. So we hear the term carbon a lot in the world, and we're also hearing increasingly more and more loads of different options for farmers to be able to gain payments from sustainable farming practices. And the really important thing that farmers need to be aware of, and we're going to discuss today, is how you can stack all of these different income streams, or not stack all of these different income streams, depending on how they overlap or not. So we've got things like private carbon payments, we've got biodiversity net gain coming in, and we've obviously got all the government payments, and then increasingly kind of supply chain payments for various activities. So it's really important that farmers are aware that all of this is existing, and how they can kind of best optimize their farming practices to essentially dip into as many pots as they can to incentivize their really transition and support their farming business, really, as we kind of lose BPS.
Thanks, Thomas. And it is, of course, a really, really big subject. It can be quite daunting, but just explain what Agrina does within this area, within this sphere.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm the UK market lead for Agrina. We currently operate Europe's largest soil carbon payment program, as Johan said. So essentially, we work with farmers that are transitioning away from a heavy, deep plough-based system towards a more reduced low-till based system. We know as you do that, you're going to emit less carbon into the atmosphere, and you're going to be able to sequester and store a certain amount of carbon into the soils. We can now quantify that to a verified standard and then issue a carbon credit based on that, which then the farmer can choose to sell if they wish. So that's our kind of role in this game. And at the minute we're quite we work with arable fields, so kind of quite specific in what we work with. And it's important that farmers can figure out how to stack different incomes for different parcels of land, as well as on the arable fields as well.
Thanks, Thomas. So carbon then a potential revenue stream for an increasing number of farmers. Jeremy, how does this sort of fit in with the general way that we're doing things as farmers, as an industry? How important is this becoming?
I think there's a risk here of trying to run before people walk. There's a lot of talk, of course, about these being very early and emergent markets and one thing and another. But I think the important thing is to try to keep an eye on where value really lies and what you're really trying to do with your business. And so if you're a farmer and looking to earn your income from commercial farming, then the trick is, I think, to keep an eye on the business of being a commercial farmer. Carbon is very important. It is the key to mitigating and managing climate change. And part of it is the key simply to having a better business with better soils and so on, as Thomas and I will agree. But in commercial terms, it's a relatively low value. It carries significant issues about monitoring it and verifying and recording it all and so on. And I think the fundamental thing is that a farmer should know their carbon, audit it, and then be ready for when the supply chain comes expecting a farmer to be managing their emissions downwards. And to try and summarize, I think where I said, because the conversation will clearly flow in over time, my view is a farmer should hoard carbon, not sell it. The value, the gross value, the area involved, it's all a splintered cottage industry. But as suppliers expect their supply, as buyers expect their suppliers, the farmers, to be becoming less emittive of carbon, to be able to show that and store it on your farm and along the way improve your soils and so on, you will have done good things. If you sell too early for too little value, you've simply entered into a liability, especially if that carbon is lost over coming years. You are still liable for that carbon. So my view on this is no, but be cautious.
Okay. So some good thoughts there already from Jeremy. Clive, you're one of the first people in the UK to get involved in this market and to start seeing it as a potential asset for your farm business. Tell me how that works.
Yeah, so I mean, I was quite keen to get involved quite early and far less cautious than Jeremy suggesting I think people should be really early on, for a couple of reasons, really. You say it's not incredibly valuable, but for 3 years now, and now we're into the 4th year, it has increased. It has been a tangible additional revenue stream for my business, which is welcome, particularly through some of the growing seasons as arable farmers that we've had in the last few years. So that counts. And also, the whole system is based on additionality. So it's not like selling the mineral rights to your land where you sell this once and that's it. You're selling your kind of annual sequestration and kind of the improvements within that. So it's a bit like, even if the one thing I would agree with Jeremy on there is, if you're not at the very least quantifying it and then making the choice, kind of turning that into certificates that can either, then you make that choice, I'll save them and sell them at a future date, or I'll sell them and monetize them this year, please. If you're not doing one of those two things, if you're just sitting waiting for the market to evolve, you've missed last year's sequestration, just like you've missed the harvest. So that's number one reason why I was keen to get involved quite early on, to not miss out on that. Whether I've chosen to sell each year or whether I've just sat on my kind of certificates is a matter of my own choice, or each individual farmer's choice. But the other reason, again, and the area I find more concerning is what Jeremy alluded to there, and I don't like those words really. An expectation of the supply chain for us as farmers to solve their scope 3 emissions, their carbon problems, and that's what this recent, the issues recently with Red Tractor and the Green Farm commitment, where really they're trying to quantify that and inset this entire, the kind of clean up basically food from the farm rather than the retailer. Now, to my mind, if we're producing a commodity, if we are sequestering carbon, that's a product that should be for sale on open markets. British Airways, ICI, whoever, any global corporation or company should basically be setting the price alongside the likes of, any of the large retailers or processors. And that way we establish the best value for farmers. We get the true price, the true value, rather than my fear, which is if we don't do anything about this and we don't create these open markets, or the likes of Greener, Trinity, Soil Capital, all the other people that are certifying this, don't develop a market, we again, as farmers, and this has happened, where we are with our combined all crops, global commodities, we become price takers rather than price setters again in this market. And I think there's a pivotal moment here, big opportunity potentially for farmers, or equally yet another big giveaway, one way or the other.
I fear this begins to miss the likely balance of supply and demand, and also the kind of approach, sort of policy approach to mitigation. Farming is now between farming and land use, we're responsible for something like 10% of the UK's emissions, and we sit on about 0.5% of UK GDP. We are actually far more likely to want to bring carbon in than we are likely to be able to offer it to other people. And so a root of one of my concerns in this is the point at which we make it available to other people, we're then not making it available to ourselves. and we have a higher need, and we have the ability to handle it. So
I think that depends
it's
very
in
much
setting.
on the farm, yeah.
It's in setting within the business. Nobody expects farming to reach net zero overall as a sector. They do expect major reductions in emissions, and that's a massive task.
So it's clear that carbon is a valuable resource. It has a value on the farm as well. It can potentially generate revenue. We don't want to let it go too cheaply. We don't necessarily want to perhaps sell it now or for too low a price. I know there are lots of contentious issues around this. Let's go back to Thomas, and if I'm on my farm and I want to get involved and I want to generate some certificates in the first instance before deciding whether to or not to sell them, whether to hoard them or to sell them, what do I do? Just explain to viewers looking at watching this webinar how that works in simple terms. And then we'll gradually take the whole thing.
Yeah, so really good debate. This is some of my favorite debates to do. So the first thing I would say is, from what everybody said, I think we can all, please shout you too if you disagree, but I think we can definitely all agree that the most important thing for every single farmer to do in the country is to quantify it and start to actually know what they're handling and dealing with. So that's absolutely no brainer. We can all agree to that. The contentious bit of where you should trade it, we could probably debate that for a long time, but the bit that we all agree on in let's actually make sure that we're quantifying and know what we're talking about is essentially important. That's the first thing that any farmer should start to do. The first, and the kind of, when we talk about that, the most important thing when you're doing a quantification is to make sure you're quantifying it to a standard that's going to be recognized and going to be valuable in the future. If you're just kind of doing it, with a, kind of non-regulated kind of random calculator and not really understanding how to fill it in or this kind of thing, it really is not going to have much value. It's quite, it might be useful for you on your farm as a management tool, that's absolutely fine. But if you want to record it and verify it properly so that in 5 years it's going to be actually useful, it's really important that you quantify it to a standard. And obviously I'm going to say Greener can do that for you, but there's obviously quite a few companies out there that are in that space of being able to quantify and sit with you as a farmer to be able to get the number. We can then obviously talk lots about, and we can talk, I'm sure there'll be loads of questions about what we do in terms of how should we decide to sell it. But I wonder if there's anything you want to talk about, you guys, in terms of quantification. I think just one point from me is it's very important that we're quantifying holistically everything that goes on within the scope. So, we're not just looking at the emissions. We need to look at the sequestration as well. We need to look at the total picture.
So there's some questions coming in. So let's try and answer some of these questions, and we'll take them in the order which to me at least seems to be perhaps the most logical. A question here from Mary DeMambro. She says, the speakers are mentioning quantifying the carbon, so measuring it. How can this be done best? Is an advisor needed? So just briefly, Thomas, if you could explain how to do it, that would be great.
Yeah, so as we've said, it needs to be, there's no point doing it unless you're doing it to the right standard. I would recommend that you come and chat to us at Greener, and we're going to be able to do that for arable farmers to that right standard. But effectively, it's a case of collecting the data that you probably already have about your farming operations. So, obviously where your fields are, what management practices have been involved in the fields, what soil type are you on, things like this. There is soil sampling involved, etc., etc. But really, if you're a farmer that's listening, just get in touch with us or a similar company, and we're going to be able to do that quantification and be able to do it. Not that complicated. You probably already got the data already. Clive's been through the process for a few years. He can tell you how it's been.
It's not difficult at all. It's basic record keeping that you've got on any farm anyway. I've tried a few different tools. The Greener one's really quite light touch, quite easy actually. My how old is he now? My 79-year-old father filled it in for me last year because I was a bit busy. So it's not complicated.
Jeremy, your view?
Yeah, what you want, I mean, there are a variety of these around, but you want it so that you can see responses to your own actions, so that you know how you're making things better. There are various measures, increasingly ones that will look deep below the soil and see how carbon is building in the soil at various depths, and indeed on the other fixed equipment on the farm, the hedges and the rest. But it is that responsiveness to action you want to be able to see, so that it then guides your behaviour, so that it is how you're dealing with your gross and your net position on emissions and sequestration.
And the other thing I'd also add is don't pay for it, because there's a lot of people out there that will be doing it to the right standard and doing it for free, basically. So have a chat to them.
I think the next step is, because one of the interesting areas is where Northern Ireland has piloted was now halfway through the sampling for its soil nutrient health scheme, is that then when it comes back, there is a level of discussion that it's useful to have about the farm in terms of where carbon is being done, but also other nutrients and so on. It becomes part of a management discussion within the farm or with advisors or however it might be, actually to try and draw the lessons out of it as to what actions you should then take.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. It's very easy to see it as just oh great, this will access a different income stream, but actually, even though when we've started, we're a long way down the road with our kind of regen no-till type stuff. We've been doing it 18 years or so that time. It's still actually focused our mind on various management decisions, and it puts a value on things like, you know, the decision whether to sell straw, you know, or to incorporate, or to incorporate or whatever. It actually puts a value on that, because you can actually see if I you know, take the offtake, take the money, I've got X amount less carbon certificates to sell as a result. So quantifies things.
So that's
a very basic point about data, which data is nothing unless something's done with it.
So just briefly, Jeremy, is a question here from Nick Cross. What precisely are we quantifying?
You are quantifying ultimately, strictly, you're quantifying the volume of carbon on the farm and how it's moving. You are then, for the purposes of what people may be wanting from you, you are looking at your over time reduction in net emissions of carbon. All this ultimately in tons of carbon equivalent.
Okay, brilliant.
And so, to some extent, that is there. That will then wrap up other things like methane and nitrous oxide and so on in it, if you're doing it fully. And then you're watching how that is done, and over time coming to understand the potential limits on what you can actually do.
Okay, thank you. And then Thomas, there's a question here from Lisa Ballard. She says, well, we've sort of covered how you measure it, but what sort of figure are you typically going to come up with, and in what unit, and how does that translate into a certificate, and what is that certificate worth? So what I'm trying to do is we're going to come up with a number of X number of pounds typically per certificate or per acre or hectare, so people can really understand this.
Yeah, so like the problem is there isn't like I'm gonna give you a range in a minute, but we just first need to acknowledge, which I'm sure everybody always says, this is a massive range, right? It's so hard to tell. It just depends so much on so many different climate factors and soil type and management and so many different things. And honestly, the best way for you to find out for your farm is just come and have a chat with us, and we'll do a free calculation. I'll tell you exactly the right number. But just to give you something, typically we see farmers kind of producing a number of certificates per hectare. A certificate represents 1 ton of CO2 equivalent. So it's not just carbon, it's all the greenhouse gas emissions, obviously, like nitrous oxide from fertilizers, obviously just a big one. So typically a UK farmer that we work with would be producing somewhere between 0.5 and 2 certificates per hectare per year. Can be all the way up to 3. It really just depends on what the farmer's done. I think my farm average was like 1.2 or 1.4, something like that per hectare per year. That is, and that's the kind of net position of my farm sequestered into the soil. But mine is a fairly good, simple, arable business. There's not too much complications.
And those certificates are worth how much?
Yeah, good question. So again, it's a range. It depends on the market. It depends who you're selling, who you want to sell it to. Do you want to sell it yourself, etc., etc. But somewhere between £30 and £50 per credit per certificate.
So we can see that it very much does have a value, and I can imagine that some people are thinking, this is money for nothing. I've got this sort of resource, I can generate an income from it, or as Jeremy says, hoard it. So Jeremy, just explain that to me.
Well, I think the problem with selling rights to your carbon away is that then those belong to somebody else. And if anything, so we start with the problem that if anything then happens to that carbon, I mean, classically a problem with tree planting, Storm Arwen comes along, or trees die of something, you then are on the hook for the carbon that you've assured somebody else exists and have to try and provide it. And I think the liability side of this has not really yet been fully absorbed by people. Some of the studies on the major and really quite reputable offsetting scheme in California is that the buffers they provide in these schemes for to meet liabilities are probably inadequate. And there are reasons why California might be slightly different in some of the arithmetic, but there is a challenge here. The next part of this is ultimately, and I've seen examples of this, ultimately you hit a ceiling on what you can sequester. You hit an equilibrium point for your soil. You hit the point where your trees really reach maturity and stop growing, or whatever it might be. I mean, obviously with livestock, there may be technical improvements that help you reduce methane to a point. But and as an interesting example quoted recently, again, one of these major beef units in Australia that goes down these routes to assure itself, Jigsaw Farm, they thought they had actually reached net zero. A certain amount of reappraisal of the technology for measuring has made it look slightly more adverse, and that's just one of the things that life is vulnerable to, not enormously adverse, but actually their soil has now hit its capacity. And at that point, there's nothing more. All they face is the risk of it coming undone, or the challenge of the challenge of holding it where it is. And I think these begin to be some of the issues. But this is where I then now go back to pick up where Clive was earlier and responding to me. The whole business of where the supply chain isn't, I think, trying to take control of farming carbon, but will be wanting farming to show its carbon performance for their scope 3. And this may be as true of a lender as it may be of a buyer of produce. This is where the ability to show that you control your carbon may become fundamental to a place in the market, and to have people come to you when you have sold away the easy things to do, and then come to you and say, now do more. That's the point when it looks really hard.
Thank you. I'm really conscious that we could get into this, the whole scope. So the whole scope. So for people who don't know, and I'm sure Jeremy and Clive and Thomas are going to tell me if I'm wrong, but scope 3 is this requirement for big businesses to carbon footprint their supply chain, their value chain, and that is going to at some point, and it is already happening, put a requirement, those big businesses, so it could be food processors or whatever, will require farmers to demonstrate and carbon footprint their own supply chain, which will then put an onus on farm businesses to reduce or manage their carbon footprint, I guess is
and Johan, there's absolutely no problem whatsoever with that, as long as it's consistent accounting throughout the food chain. So if my buyers want me to quantify my scope 3 for them, well, therefore the people I'm buying from, so if I'm buying fertilizer from Yara or tractors from Fendt or Clown buying some Class, I'm going to want them to do it as well. Because what we can't have is a situation where it all ends up on the farmer, where Yara claim they're net zero because they don't actually use any fertilizer. It's all those farmers' faults for using the stuff. That's what we've got to be really careful of, where it all lands on us. Because if it's consistent throughout the food chain, then farming can become net zero quite easily, because that fertilizer is not my fault. I didn't produce it. I just used it. And then ultimately somebody ate the food that was producing that. So then you say, well, all of the carbon emissions actually land on the consumer. How does that change or fix anything?
Thank you. So it's interesting because there is we agree that there are challenges around this. I'm just going to get, so we've got these certificates. We've generated these certificates that Thomas has so kindly quantified the carbon on our farms for us. We know how much we're generating in terms of certificates, and we know how much that is. Couple of questions here. One from Ollie Wright for you, Thomas. Where can these, should we wish to do so, where can the certificates gained be sold or traded? How does that bit work?
Yeah, absolutely. So okay, so let's take it back to the bit we agree on again. We've produced these credits. We're all happy that we've got some. It's then, the important thing to say is you need to think of carbon much like harvesting a crop. Every year you're going to be doing carbon stuff because you're going to be, growing a crop and burning some diesel, but also maybe planting cover crop and adding organic matter and all that kind of stuff. So every year you're going to get a carbon position. And every year it's going to be slightly different depending on what you've done. But every year you're going to hopefully be able to issue some credits based on what you've done. You've done some good stuff that year. So every year I'm going to harvest some carbon credits just the same as I harvested some wheat. And I'm going to sit in my shed. I've got my stock of carbon credits. So let's say there's 100 credits in there. It's then just the same as your, shed next door with all the wheat in it. You then decide if and how and if you'd like to trade it. Now, a lot of farmers that we work with absolutely don't want to trade it. They're kind of in Jeremy's camp where they, I think I should keep this and, this is going to be important for the future. Absolutely fine. So they're just hoarding them and sitting them and keeping them for the future. No issues about that. If you'd like to be a person that needs some income because you need some seed to plant the cover crop for next year or whatever it might be, there is the opportunity to trade those credits. Now, there's really two markets that would like to buy those credits from you. The first one is called the offset market, and that's effectively where we're selling credits to companies outside of agriculture that would like to support agriculture to get to net zero. And they're doing that because they want to feel good in their operation. So, for example, it might be a real estate company. They need to pour lots of concrete because they've got to build this skyscraper. Concrete's a really bad emitter. So they do something to compensate for that action, and they pay some money for some farmers to grow some cover crops, for example, and they'll buy those credits. That's what's called the offset market. We then have, which we've talked about lots, the inset market, where somebody who's a grain trading company or a food company, whoever it is, a CPG, they would like to support farmers that also supply wheat into the commodities market. So they would buy carbon credits from a farmer that's also growing wheat, so they can feel like the bread, when they bought this flour to make these biscuits, they've supported some farmer that's also produced some flour in the specific country. So they're kind of the two markets that farmers can choose and deal in if they wish. They obviously very different markets. They do have a little bit different pricing, but the most important thing that I see in the markets is that we've never had opportunity for farmers to get money from outside of agriculture before. This is the first time ever, really, that farming has had the opportunity to get external money outside of the agricultural supply chain in. And it's really exciting because that's where a lot of money is. And so it's really important that we keep that offset market there, even if we don't want to trade in it much, but it puts a value on the carbon so that we as farmers know that we're going to get a fair market value price should the inset market would like to buy it as well. They can very happily buy my carbon. I've got 800 hectares here, we're farming. I'll happily sell this carbon to somebody within my value chain, but they need to pay at least the same as the offset market would pay. Otherwise, why would I sell it to them? So that's like the really important thing to say. I can't quite remember what the question was, Johan, but it's really about I think it was about how you actually physically do it. I mean, so at Greener, we kind of, that's a service we provide, right? So we have a trading team, just like you have a grain trading team, we have a carbon credit trading team that do that every day for farmers. And, you kind of choose if you'd like to sell, and then you choose, and then you obviously get the price of the day, just kind of the same as the grain trading market would work. But farmers can sell it themselves. So, if you know a company that you'd like to sell carbon to, it's something that it's just a buyer and seller agreement. You can go and do it yourself.
Thanks, Thomas. Jeremy, tax rules on trading carbon is a question here. Elena Afsar.
Still emerging. There's now a working party with the Treasury that I sit on that's just been formed to look at this. We've just had a statement from the Treasury or HMRC that's reversed the position on VAT, so that dealings in credits can now be in these voluntary markets are within the scope of VAT, and we assume that will mean standard rated 20%. But the full details have not yet quite emerged, but we've had the statement. This then, because I was playing as Thomas was speaking with the analogy that Thomas is rather looking at almost a profit and loss account, and I'm looking at a balance sheet at this side of these things. If you want to pursue that as the starting point of an analogy, the question is out as to whether these matters are income tax or capital gains tax. Probably people will tend to treat them in the way that's been described as an income tax matter, but I don't think there's really yet a settled view. That's one of the reasons why, with the great consultation last year, we asked for this working party so we can sit down and debate the issues with the revenue and arrive at a shared understanding so that these markets can be dealt with greater confidence. But that's about the best answer I can give you.
To date, I could ask that. To date, my accountants dealt with it very much as an income tax. As additional income. I mean, I'd rather it was capital gains tax. It costs less. I think the issue is I think it's probably right. It's income on the basis that it's probably not a disposal of capital, though it could be. It probably is, though. I think the acceptance of a liability for which you're being paid money, that probably gets it into income. I just hope we can clarify this quite quickly, just for everybody's sake. But it comes back not to being so much uncertain about tax as people being uncertain about the deal, what actually is the nature of the deals they're doing. Once that's sorted, then we know we can look at accounting and tax.
And a quick question for Clive. Clive, we've sort of talked about the concerns that if you sell all of your carbon credits and you might need them in the future, or the price might go up, you might be a little bit out of pocket. When you come to selling yours, what's your sort of strategy? Do you retain half of them and sell half, or how does it work so that you generate income but mitigate the risk at the same time?
So far, I've chosen personally to sell each year. With the benefit of hindsight, that probably wasn't the best thing to do, because actually the value's gone up every single year. So I'm getting, it was worth more in year 2 and year 1, and now more again this 3rd year, and hopefully more again in the 4th year. So that shows actually the direction that the markets are going in. I mean, I've took the view a little bit, make hay while the sun shines. This may not develop. I don't know whether as an industry we will be able to develop an independent offset market that Thomas absolutely nailed his description of it there, that will place a true value on it, or whether it becomes a default condition of supply and therefore actually ends up adding no more to our bottom line whatsoever. So from that point of view, where there's real money being offered, we mentioned tax there. Well, I've always taken the view that tax is a good problem to have, because you don't pay any tax unless you're making any money. So I've taken that view to date. As things are evolving, actually, I'm becoming a little bit more minded in future years that I might just start to bank some of these certificates more, because it seems a bit more here to stay. I think it's a market that just gets a bit more grown up every year and a bit more sorted and a bit more, the answers to things like, how's it taxed? How's it work? Are there any potential liabilities? What if we, take our soils to the maximum? I mean, just to answer that point, arable soils in the UK are generally so degraded that we've got a hell of a long way to go before we get to the point where you can't get any more carbon into them. Yes. To be quite honest, if I ever get to the point where I can't get any more carbon into my soils, I won't need to worry about sequestration anymore, really, or the income from it.
So some of that, I think, then comes back to a very basic point where I started about looking at the business of being a commercial farmer. In a sense, this is a proxy for looking at fertility. It is and resilience in the land, and looking at the other things that are really important, and I think that's the critical thing to be watching in all of this. And there are these other aspects, but keeping an eye on the central functions of being a commercial farmer seem to me absolutely critical.
Yeah. Thank you. Another question to Jeremy, and then I'm going to come back to you, Thomas. But a couple of people asking, Ben Makowiecki is saying, question for Jeremy, what might the effect on land value be if credits are sold away? And a similar question from Catherine Paulson. One of the biggest concerns is the impact on the residual land value.
Yep.
So could you just explain
Yeah,
that?
I mean, again, very little market evidence on this at all. So there's very little to go on. I was talking with somebody the other day looking at a woodland where the woodland credits have been sold away, and that was understood to have been sold at a significant discount. Now, whether that was a genuine forestry commercial timber woodland where the value would lie massively in the timber and not really in the carbon, or whether it was something else, I simply don't know. How this would relate to farmland, we don't know. There's little evidence, but going back to the tax argument, it is that sort of argument that leads people to run the thing that we think isn't right, but that it's a capital gains tax matter, because that would then look like something that detracts from the value of the land. We think that's wrong, but to focus on the question that's been put, we cannot say that the land will necessarily be of the same value if credits have been sold away. No, there is that liability attached. Whether it's a large or small matter, there's not the evidence, and it may just be it's within the noise of land valuation, and so nobody notices. For some land, it may matter more. There's no evidence.
Surely, Jeremy, this depends very much on the length of any future contract that's been entered into. If there's no commitment beyond either 1 year, 5 years, 10 years, then for the next landowner, the person buying it, if there's no commitment going forward, well, it should make no difference to values at all. If you're contracted to 10 years of limited use of land, then that's different.
And I would agree on that. I mean, the woodland credits, of course, is looking ahead several decades as the woodland carbon credits. If we're looking, though, at true carbon sequestration, doing it properly to give people assurance, that's 100 years. Just as nutrient neutrality is 125 years, biodiversity net gain 30 years. You are to do this job properly, to meet the kind of challenges we face. You are entering into really substantial commitments, and you need to think about the value in terms of those kind of time horizons. And I've looked previously at 1 or 2 nutrient neutrality deals, and people have been offered a figure that looks very, very attractive to them. So divide by 125.
The Agreena agreement, doesn't time me for any number of years. And when it comes to those arguments over permanence are interesting because, as you say, even if Microsoft pay to buy millions of acres of forestry or whatever, and then it burns down, there is no permanence, is there really? Even coal, even the dinosaurs that we fetched out of the ground and burned, even that wasn't permanent. It was longer, just different lengths of time.
But that gets exactly the point. Going back to the Californian study. They provided within the deal reserve buffers to accommodate where you have fires in woodland. In the first 7 years of their scheme, they burnt the buffer for a century. Yes. And ultimately, the person who has sold the carbon is still liable to go out into the market and find that carbon for the company that bought it. This is my point about liability. And if you're just doing if you're just doing a 1 year deal, well, then almost what is that doing for anybody? Apart from, it's comforting your and it would feed directly into your sense that you are very definitely the income tax side of the line on that one. But in terms of the larger national picture on carbon, what have we done?
Thomas, could you explain that? There's just a couple of questions. One, and which we're sort of touching on this idea that there's a question from Julian Gardner: weather and other events can be out of the farmer's control and can reverse gains made with carbon sequestration. I've got so many questions coming in here; it's quite hard to keep track of them. There's another.
I think that was just a perfect
similar one below though. That this idea that. What happens if things are reversed? But these are 1 year agreements, aren't they? So if you could explain that.
So this is absolutely the most perfect point to talk about. So thanks for bringing that up, everybody. So the really exciting thing here is this is, to be honest, this is the value of Agreena, right? This is why Agreena exists, and companies that do the calculations that sit in the middle need to exist. what we have if we look at the kind of carbon market globally, is we have carbon credit producers, in this case farmers, let's say landowners. They are sitting there and they're doing some good actions in the field. What they need is flexibility, mostly because of weather conditions and because weather changes. And what they would like is they would like the buyers to commit to paying a good high price for a long period of time, right? That's just true. On the other side, we have the people that would like farmers to do good stuff. So let's call them, food companies, or even, offset companies, just any companies that would like planning to get better and do good stuff. They would like farmers to commit for a long, long period of time. And they would like flexibility in their own choice of where they spend their money and how they spend their money and who they get to spend their money on. So we've got this market that is not going to be able to function together, because on one side they want flexibility and they want the other party to be committed, and on the other side we have a party that wants flexibility and want the other side to be committed. So that's why an organization like Agrina effectively sits in the middle and guarantees both sides, right? So we give Clive, flexibility to do the operations he needs to do, because he needs to manage his farm, in the best reason for this year. It's been a very wet year in the UK here. That's just true, and it means he's going to manage his farm slightly differently. And then on the other side, we need to be able to guarantee to buyers that we can store X amount of carbon for X period of time. So that's the value of Agrina, is that we give each side the flexibility and guarantees they need, and then we're having to take the kind of risk effectively of managing both sides of that commitment and liability. And what that then means is, the real reason that we can then do that is diversified, because our portfolio spreads so wide. We're in 20 countries, so if we have an issue in the UK, it's not going to be happening somewhere else. And then also just scale. If we have 2 million hectares under management, if 1 hectare gets ploughed for some reason, we can absorb and we can account and we can manage. So that's really, people always don't like middle people to manage these things, but in this case, it has a huge amount of value.
So some people are saying, how long does a carbon certificate last? How long are the agreements when selling credits, etc.? If you could just briefly explain that in relation to Agrina, Thomas.
Yeah, absolutely. So we have one contracting system with farmers. It is the term length on the contract is a 10-year contract that we set a baseline for 10 years, but anybody can leave any year. So it kind of effectively becomes a kind of 1-year rolling contract where you can opt out any year. Obviously, we would like you to stay in for the full 10-year period, but you can opt out any year. So to have that flexibility. Then the second question, how long do credits last? So when a credit's issued, it's issued against that year. So, you're going to get a 2023 credit that was issued for 2023 with this methodology. That will last forever. It will last forever. The question of will it go up and down or down in value? I'm not going to tell you exactly. I'm not going to give you a perfect answer on that, but it could go either way. But it doesn't. It'll last forever, obviously, until you sell it, and then it's not yours anymore.
So the farmer can sell it, and then can the person buying it then sell it on to somebody else? Does it work like that, or is that, can it only be sold once?
So effectively, it depends. It really depends who you want to do the trading. If you want to do the trading yourself, obviously you can do whatever you want. If you want us to do the trading, we're going to be trading it to somebody that's then going to retire it and actually use it. So it kind of just depends how you want to do the trading, really. But this is the thing that kind of, I'm sure Jeremy will say, is, if you're doing the trading as a farmer yourself, then you're kind of managing that liability risk. Whereas if you get somebody to manage it, to take that liability from you, that's quite valuable.
Yeah, I mean, the Agrina case, without speaking for Thomas's book, is he's pooling risk across 2 million hectares or whatever it is. And it's on that basis, rather than on the basis simply of Clive, that you're talking to your buyers. And so you are hoping you can keep that pool of developing credits available, so long as there's a market of people wanting to buy them.
Yeah.
Clive, do you want to expand on that point at all?
Yeah, well, it goes back to that thing of like, as far as where Thomas pointed there. From my point of view, a farmer, I could come out of the scheme next year, could decide to not do it again. So that's as far as that's the length of my commitment, so to speak. That's why there's a value in having that middleman, having that broker. Their margin between there obviously degrades the value the farmer gets back. We're not getting the full value of a ton of carbon or a certificate, but they're not doing nothing for that. They're providing the methodology and the tool to quantify that, and also taking that risk between the two of satisfying both sides of this by aggregating the supply versus the demand, basically, aren't they? So they have a value in this space. I'm kind of slightly infamous for being no fan of middlemen in farming. There's far too much of that in farming, but I think this is a case where I think that there is a genuine need to develop that market. And also that important bit, I keep coming back to it, sorry, but is having this offset market that sets the price. Because if it just becomes inset, if it's just within the food supply chain, it will become the default condition of supply, a bit like Red Tractor was originally supposed to provide a premium and ended up just becoming a default condition of supply. And this isn't happening with other countries. If we're not careful, what we do is we help retailers offset that scope 3, and that enables them to bring in more imports, because obviously imported food has a carbon footprint versus UK food. So I think, I think that's, companies like Agrina do have a role to play here, and it is kind of acting in that buffer between supply and demand.
Yeah, you face major overhead costs either way, because either Agrina goes through the exercise of just arbitraging all this risk and pooling people in many ways, or you have a deal that has to stand the costs of monitoring, verification and reporting over a period of time. And those are costs that are substantially underestimated for many of these markets, not just carbon. Yeah. So this whole business of managing that. But just to pick up, I would draw the boundary between offsetting and insetting somewhere else. I think everything Thomas has described I regard as offsetting. Insetting is where I would have it within the business. That's where I would be hoarding. So there's a whole policy structure around the mitigation hierarchy. And the first one is you do no damage. So you don't emit carbon. Well, that's no use if you're a farmer. The second is that you make it good on your property. And that's what I regard as insetting. And then the last resort is offsetting, which is where you're trying then to do a deal with somebody else about it. And that's that's where we are with biodiversity net gain, where it's done off-site and other things. But it's the answer when you haven't done the others.
But we have to be very aware as farmers. We are the only industry. Farming and forestry is the only industry that has the ability to sequester any carbon. Every other industry that we can pretty much consider or talk about are always going to be emitters. They can say they're net zero, but only if they offset. They can never get a carbon footprint to zero. We're the only, growing stuff. Photosynthesis is the only thing that actually sequesters. So that really should put us in. We should be in control of this market, because we should call shots here rather than being price takers. We ultimately should hold all the cards as farmers if we can just organise ourselves to not let it be taken from us with this inset market.
There are other people who are capable of taking themselves down to net zero by reducing their emissions rather than by sequestration, and that's where the electricity market is getting itself to in this country.
It sounds very creative accounting in a lot of cases, I think, really, in the way that it works. Unless you're actually taking carbon dioxide out of the air, and as far as I'm aware, any plants do that.
We're moving to an increasing number of periods where we're using virtually no fossil fuel in electricity generation. And that's what I mean about going down to net zero on that side of the equation. And that's where we've made the largest part of our reductions in emissions on that side.
True, but even a wind turbine or a solar panel doesn't build itself. Yeah, there is still a carbon footprint. Yes. Even the offices, the computers that run these things, they've got to offset at some point, and we're the people that can provide that offset.
What we've been talking about is, and not to go completely right back to the beginning, but this, Thomas, is all about the arable sector. There are a few questions that are saying, is this relevant to grassland management? Is this just for arable? What about livestock farms? So could you explain that?
Yeah, absolutely. So, so as a greener, we only work with arable lands. That's kind of what we've covered a little bit. Obviously, Clive's an arable farmer as well, and we've talked about it a lot. But all of the same. I don't think we've talked about anything that's kind of not relevant to grass to any landowner effectively. I think everything we've covered is relevant to everybody, and it's all the same things that need to happen. The calculations still need to happen. Everything needs to happen. The thing that we haven't talked about too much is the stacking element of, we've had today the SFI new announcements, whatever it is, the £73 a hectare for direct drilling. This is going to be really exciting as we start to see more and more incentives for farmers to do more and more and more of this stuff, how farmers can stack these incomes and what they can stack, and then also how they can essentially make the best use of all of these different assets that they have going on.
And explain that to us then, how farmers can stack these different incomes.
Yeah, so it's very clear. Everybody can read it on the government SFI website. It's very, very clear that there's in heavy support of private income and private markets for farmers. So all of the SFI options are absolutely compatible with private market industries. In terms of what we do, maybe Jeremy knows a bit more about the nutrient neutrality and things like that. But then we've also got lots of other private funding schemes coming in. There's obviously the whole carbon one, there's biodiversity, and there's going to be more and more money coming from a lot of different directions. So it's important that as farmers, again, you start to understand exactly what you're doing and the value of it, and then you're going to be in the best place to make the most of it.
I'm just going to come in a bit earlier on the livestock side first, and then pick up, because I think everything that we would see is that while arable farmers are frequently conscious of depleted soils, all the studies show that across West Britain, grassland soils are significantly depleted as well. And a lot of work that's been done, for example, again, I've referred to it earlier in Northern Ireland, the Sustainable Agricultural Land Management report and so forth, shows there very significant gains by land management in improving a whole run of things, carbon and nutrients in soils by good management, that yields improved profits, that also yields environmental gain. We're well away from the point where any of this is intention. So in a sense, the principles that Thomas is talking to, I think, are just applicable across British broadacre agriculture, however you look at it. Obviously, livestock farming brings in the other aspects of how you manage animals, as we're all talking about soil at this point, and by extension, possibly hedges and trees. But actually, also how you look at the animals in this is the key part of livestock farming when you get to it. Equally, carbon sequestration in livestock soils is frequently helped by manures and slurries and animal waste, and that gives some more potential in that. Coming back to the stacking, I mean, and it slightly depends how you want to talk about this. Very clearly, SFI and a number of these other schemes are there, and DEFRA will see these broadly as independent of what Thomas and others are doing in these markets. DEFRA is relatively, so far in its policies, is relatively tolerant. What we're watching, though, and the word additionality was used earlier, what we're watching is the private markets getting, and if I put it the way they would put it in a moment, you will see exactly why they're getting edgy about some of this. They would put it, and looking at the British Standards Institute's work in this area, they would say, why should I pay for something that's already happening? Mm-hmm. I'm going to buy something additional if I'm genuinely buying something that wasn't going to happen. And put that way, I think you begin to see, so I am doing things, let's say I'm planting trees for a scheme. At that point, why would the private market then pay me for carbon in those trees? Because those trees are going to be there anyway. And watching the evolution of some of the British standards that are going to guide how significant parts of the private markets go, and the Treasury, I know, has been looking at this because it's an argument I've got with them at the moment. This is an area where they look a lot less tolerant on some of these things. It's where, for example, Microsoft and others have now moved away from viewing renewable energy as something to use for offsetting, because renewable energy now floats in its own in the commercial markets. It's going to happen anyway if it's going to happen. It's where can I, as a private investor, put my money to achieve change that really means something. And all the criticism of greenwashing, all the criticism of previous less reputable offsetting schemes, a lot of which have never really delivered or happened or even done anything. All this is coming home to roost with that kind of actually quite rational approach.
It's fair comment, I think, really, because obviously with SFI now, now it's a lot clearer, and obviously for an arable farmer become a very significant thing, particularly if you're already gone down that regen route. It's clear that much of what is encouraged and is economic through to maximise your carbon are also very much the same things that SFI is encouraging. I've spent my entire farming career thinking that from a farming point of view, that the things that I can sell are wheat, barley, beans, oilseed rape, that kind of thing. This year now I'm in a situation where over a third of my farm is basically creating non-food output for me. So that SFI income, that carbon income, other BNG type stuff on probably a third of the acres that we manage and are farming now. Yet it will probably represent more like 70-75% of my gross output next year. So, I mean, it's incredible from my point of view. It's incredibly exciting times, I think, for a UK arable farmer. If you're willing to take advantage of these situations or make the best of them, let's say, and see these there's a demand for these environmental products, whether it's carbon or SFI or stewardship based or outside BNG type cash. There's a demand for it that, to me, it seems more wanted right now than the food we produce. So who am I to not supply a market that is asking me to supply them, open checkbook to tell them what they want?
But to that, I would add a longer term view, which is you are being paid. One of the ways to look at it, because all these schemes are only options, none of them are salvation. You don't have to take them. They're to be done on their business merits. Mm-hmm. But what you are doing, if we look at some of the soils management stuff and the legume fallows and the like, yes, it's an interesting alternative to oilseed rape as a break crop and so forth. But what you are arguably doing is taking the king's shilling in order to have your soils improved. That is your fertility in 5-10 years' time. And if you're being paid to do something that probably would be sensible to do anyway, but which you might not otherwise have got round to doing, there's a logic for looking at it in that light. Yeah. Again, we're coming back to profit and loss or balance sheet, and things turn up in both. But it's
current arable figures, Jeremy. I think you're actually doing both right now, because the risk profile of the likes of break crops like oilseed rape, the risk profile and also the actual gross margins are lower. Plus, you're investing in improving soils. So now it's a win-win for a farmer, isn't it? Yeah.
Yep.
You're stacking yourself, Clive. Yeah.
Sorry.
You're stacking yourself.
Yes. And I mean, it was a question, in terms of DEFRA's attitude to that. I think it was at Groundswell 2 years ago. I asked Janet Hughes directly that question about, how would they view, kind of selling carbon on land that was also receiving SFI payments, say for direct drilling or ALH mixes or whatever. And at that point, she made it quite clear that they were happy to let commercial markets evolve and build, so that they weren't going to interfere with that. So
no, DEFRA's not. I think it's the reaction of some of the private markets that might.
Yeah.
We're almost out of time. I'm going to ask something a number of questioners have alluded to. Who's sort of policing this market, Thomas? I mean, to ensure that things are all as they should be.
Yeah. So basically it's the standard. It's very important that the standard, which we kind of touched on earlier when we were talking about measuring it to the right standard, it's very important that the standard that you issue the credits to or do anything with is the right one. So there's kind of 2 or 3 globally that are kind of the best ones. So really the 2 are Gold Standard or Vera. They are kind of the 2 ones that are the most globally recognized. And then we have lots of legislation. Really, there's a lot of legislation coming out of the EU. There's a lot of legislation coming out of the US. And we have things like the Task Force for Scaling the Voluntary Carbon Market. I think that's what's called. I can never remember it exactly. Which is now headed up by Mark Carney, the Bank of England, whatever it's called. director, and to be honest, there's a huge amount of regulation that's involved in this market, and just agreeing we have to be audited by 3 separate parties before we get anywhere near being able to do anything.
Thank you. And Jeremy, you're happy that this? I mean, it is a fledgling market, but it is working.
It's big. Well, I think what you're looking at is a series of overlocking markets, some of which are probably more reputable than others. And Thomas is obviously making the case for a greener in this. It's only very recently, as said, that just the last couple of weeks, the Treasury has issued this change of view about the VAT status, because previously it only took the official emissions trading scheme as being genuinely a business operation, and excluded all these markets. We've still not been told beyond carbon what its view is of biodiversity net gain credits or nutrient neutrality or other things. So this is still to that extent evolving, but they are ultimately regulatory markets. They depend upon the regulations around it. They depend upon policies around carbon. I mean, ultimately, there becomes before we get there, an interesting thing, of course, happened last September when the government started looking again at nutrient neutrality. And there was a shudder through the system that was just beginning to develop trading credits because the government looked like changing the rules. And that recovered its balance. And anybody already doing a deal was probably well advised to carry on rather than wait a year and disrupt the development market. But it becomes quite interesting because carbon markets are ultimately a transitional market. They're here for the period that we're trying to get down to net zero. Assume, just for the purposes of argument, that we're capable of reaching net zero in 2050. And we know all the all the arguments and uncertainties around that, but assume we are. At that point, the carbon market's probably disappeared. It'll have done its job. This is putting a price squeeze on people to change their behavior to reduce the emissions so we hit net zero. Once done, and doubtless a small market remains at the margin, but value disappears. It's a function of its regulatory, of its policy drivers. But that's 20-something years away, so we'll cope with it now. We'll cope for now.
And that is a very, very good point at which to draw this to a close. It's been a really, really interesting discussion. I don't think I have ever hosted a Farmers Weekly webinar with so many questions that have come in as we've been talking. So thank you to everybody who has submitted a question, and apologies for not being able to answer them during the webinar where we were allowed to do so. I think we'll probably pass these questions on to Jeremy, Clive, and to Thomas. But for now, to everybody for tuning in, as it were, thank you very much for attending this Farmers Weekly webinar in association with Agrina on carbon stacking, what you need to know. Hopefully that was a good whistle-stop tour, but with some useful insights as to what to be aware of when it comes to carbon stacking and what you need to know. So thank you to Cambridgeshire farmer Thomas Gent, market lead, UK market lead for Agrina, which runs Europe's largest soil carbon payment programme, to Jeremy Moody, secretary and advisor to the Central Association of Agricultural Valuers, a specialist body with 3,000 professional members, and last but by no means least, to Staffordshire zero-till farmer Clive Bailey for stepping in and joining us, as it were, at the last moment, managing partner of TWB Farms, founder and owner of AgriWeb Media, which operates the Farming Forum, and early adopter of as somebody who saw the opportunities to be had from the fledgling carbon market. So thank you to everybody, and I believe this will be available online afterwards, so you'll be able to watch it all over again should you so wish to do so at your leisure. So thank you everybody for tuning in with us to this Farmers Weekly webinar in association with Agrina. I'm your host, Johan Tasker. Good evening and thank you.